I still hear the chains when the wind moves through pine and ash. That night, Georgia burned, not from heaven's lightning, but from the wrath of those once bound in silence. The mistress's laughter had echoed through the big house hours before the flames rose. By dawn, her empire of cruelty lay in smoke and screams. They called it madness. I called it freedom bought in fire. And I was there when her secret finally died. I was born beneath the whispering pines of coastal Georgia in 1847, beneath a sky so heavy it pressed the breath from your chest. I never knew the word home, only quarters built from splintered boards and prayers. My mother said I came into this world on a Sunday night, when the bell for evening work still rang and the overseer's lantern cut through the dark like a curse. She named me Samuel, though the mistress called me boy. My earliest memory is of heat, the iron stove in the kitchen, the sun over the cane fields, and the iron collar that burned the neck of an old man named Isaac. The smell of singed flesh is something you never forget. It stains the soul like soot. The plantation was called Rosehill, though no roses ever grew there. Only rows of cotton stretching farther than the eye could bear, guarded by whitewashed fences and the sharp crack of whips. Every dawn began with that sound, leather on skin, and ended with a silence so deep it felt like the world had died. The mistress ruled over it all. Her husband had long since passed, leaving her with land, gold, and two sons whose tempers mirrored her own. People in town called her the Lady of Rosehill, but among us, she was the Iron Mistress. Her face never seemed to move, carved from the same stone as the marble angels on her porch. I grew strong early, swinging a hoe taller than I was. The overseer, Mr. Kane, said I had the shoulders of a man, though I was barely 12. He liked to test those shoulders with his whip, counting lashes like scripture. My mother begged me to stay quiet, to bow my head, but something inside me began to hum, a low, dangerous song that I could never quite silence. At night we whispered stories under the floorboards, of freedom beyond the river, of men who slipped through the swamps and found heaven on the other side. But every tale ended the same way, with chains or with fire. Then, one evening, the mistress herself walked among the cabins, her sons trailing behind like ghosts. She said she needed strong stock for the coming year. Her eyes paused on me, and though she smiled, something in that smile chilled my blood. From that night on, the whispering never stopped, and none of us could guess what those whispers would become. Morning on Rosehill began before light. The horn would sound, low, mournful, like an animal that already knew its fate, and we would rise. Dew clung to our feet, mixing with the red dirt until the ground itself looked blood-stained. From the porch, the overseer's voice cut through the haze. Move, or the whip moves first. We bent to the rows. Cotton, cane, and tobacco, each plant a separate chain that tied us to the earth. The sun rose like punishment, baking the breath out of every chest. The air smelled of sweat, iron, and dust. By noon, our backs glistened as if the heat itself were trying to melt us away. The overseer, Mr. Kane, rode the line on a gray horse with blind eyes. He carried two things, a pistol and a ledger. One kept order, the other kept count. When a field hand faltered, he recorded the name before the shot rang out. Then he'd mark a single black line through the page. That line meant someone's mother would wake to an empty corner that night. The mistress watched from her balcony, her white dress flickering like a ghost behind the railings. She rarely spoke, but we could feel her gaze, cold as a blade across our necks. The townsfolk said she had the grace of a queen. To us, she was the storm that never broke. At the end of each harvest day, she held her inspection. We'd line up by the barn, trembling, while she and her two sons walked the line. They were young, barely men, but cruel in the way only the sheltered can be. One would carry a riding crop, the other a flask. Their laughter always came before the pain. That winter was hard, colder than sin. Frost bit through the cabins, and the weak fell silent one by one. Yet still we were sent into the fields. I remember one morning when the ground was white with ice. We left tracks like blood streaks across the snow. Kane told us, cotton doesn't care if you freeze. Neither did the mistress. I began to keep count, not of the lashes, but of the graves. 42 mounds by February. 42 names swallowed by the soil. Each one whispered a little louder inside my head, telling me that patience was just another kind of chain. At night, when the moon hung low, I'd look toward the big house. Lamps still burned long after midnight. Sometimes I'd see the mistress pacing, her sons arguing, shadows stretching behind them like long fingers. Rumors crept through the quarters, rumors too dark to speak above a whisper. We didn't know what went on inside those walls, but we knew it was poison, and the poison was spreading. The day it finally reached the fields, everything changed. They called her Lady Margaret Rosehill in town, though no flower ever dared grow near her. To us she was the mistress of iron and silk, iron in her rule, silk in her voice. Her footsteps on the porch meant the day's mercy had ended. When she spoke, the overseer bowed his head. Even Cain, the man who carried death in his ledger, trembled when she turned her eyes his way. Those eyes were a pale gray, like river stones after rain, beautiful, but cold enough to drown you. She dressed in white lace even in the fields, parasol glinting in the sun, a symbol that pain never touched her. Sometimes she would stand beside a whipping post, motionless, watching the punishment as though she were attending church. Her lips moved, but it was not prayer, it was counting. 1, 2, 3, until the back before her turned crimson. Her sons followed close, learning cruelty like arithmetic. The older, Thomas, had her face and her temper. The younger, Henry, hid behind nervous smiles and trembling hands. Together they moved through Rosehill like two shadows chasing the same light, one cruel, one broken. Inside the big house, everything gleamed: brass railings, silver dishes, polished portraits of ancestors who stared down like judges from another century. But beneath that beauty, a smell lingered, something sour, like rot behind perfume. We spoke of it in whispers, wondering if sin had a scent. Margaret believed she owned everything that breathed within her fences: land, animals, souls. She spoke of stock and breeding seasons, words that made the men in the quarters clench their fists when no one was watching. She saw people the way a butcher sees cattle: by weight, by cost, by the strength of their backs. And every decision she made seemed to come from that same place of hunger. Each winter she held a feast, a show for the town gentry. Carriages would roll up the drive, laughter spilling out before the doors even opened. From the quarters, we could see the lights flicker through the trees, hear the fiddle scrape, smell roasted meat while our own pots stayed empty. The guests toasted her as the Angel of Rosehill. But among us, the name changed. We called her the Lady of Smoke and Chains. One night, I was sent to serve wine in the big house. I carried a silver tray heavy enough to crush my wrists. She watched me from her seat at the head of the table, her gray eyes glinting in candlelight. "You have your mother's look," she said quietly, as if remembering something unpleasant. The room fell still. Then she smiled, a thin curve that never reached her eyes. "Strong stalk," she added. The laughter that followed scraped against my skin like the edge of a blade. When I left the hall, I saw Cain in the corridor, whispering to her eldest son. Their voices were sharp, hurried, secret. Thomas's face had gone pale, and Cain kept glancing toward me as though I were some ghost who had walked through their talk. I slipped away before they noticed, but the sound of the mistress's voice carried after me. "No one outside this house will ever know." That sentence followed me for months. Through harvest, through hunger, through nights when the wind moaned across the fields like a mourning mother. Whatever they hid inside that house was a secret worth killing for. And before the year was over, they would. By the spring of 1848, Rosehill had grown quieter, but never peaceful. The wind carried whispers instead of birdsong. Even the river that once shimmered behind the house ran dull and gray, as if it too had grown tired of washing away blood. The mistress no longer smiled. Her once perfect hair hung loose, streaked with white like frost creeping over stone. Her sons spoke little, moving through the halls as if haunted. The eldest, Thomas, drank more each night, his laughter breaking in strange places. Henry, the younger, prayed at odd hours, his voice trembling against the chapel walls. Something had happened in that house. Something unspeakable. We in the quarters heard fragments carried on the air. The cook whispered that the mistress had locked herself in the nursery for 3 days. Others said they'd seen a small coffin being carried out before dawn, the cloth so black it swallowed the light. No one dared ask who had died, yet the overseer king seemed unaffected. He barked orders louder than ever, punishing the faintest hesitation with lash or rope. He told us the mistress wanted perfection that season, that failure was no longer tolerated. His eyes gleamed as if he enjoyed saying her words aloud. One night, when the moon was high and pale, I was sent to carry water to the big house. The air inside was heavy, thick with perfume, sweat, and something else decay. I paused in the hallway when I heard them arguing. Thomas's voice, desperate. "You've damned us, mother. The whole house reeks of sin." Then hers, low and trembling. "We are judged by survival, not by heaven." The slap that followed echoed down the hall. Then silence. Then a door creaking open. I pressed myself against the wall as the mistress stepped out, her candlelight spilling across the corridor. She stopped when she saw me. Her eyes locked on mine, gray, lifeless, hollow. She didn't speak, just studied me as if trying to remember something long forgotten. Then she whispered, "You've seen too much already." She walked away, leaving the scent of lilacs and something bitter behind her. I wanted to breathe, but my lungs refused. That night, the quarters buzzed with rumors. Some said the mistress had gone mad. Others said the house was cursed, that every cruelty committed within its walls had come back to collect its debt. A few of the older men swore they saw figures in the windows, faces of those who died in the fields, staring down from the second floor. By midsummer, the air itself turned sour. The crops withered, the well water grew foul, and the mistress's sons began to avoid the overseer. I once caught Cain watching Thomas with a look that wasn't obedience, it was fear. That was when I understood. The power at Rosehill was shifting. For years, pain had moved in one direction, from the house down to the fields. But now, something unseen was pushing back. The nights grew longer. Dogs barked at nothing. The church bell rang once at midnight, though no hand touched the rope, and I began to hear my mother's voice in my dreams again, whispering the same words she'd told me as a child. "Fire cleansed what iron cannot." I woke up with my fists clenched and a plan forming like smoke in my chest. Whatever evil the mistress had birthed inside that house, it would not live to see another year. By winter, Rosehill felt like a coffin nailed shut. The frost bit through every crack in the cabins, and the sky above the cane fields turned the color of pewter. We worked slower, spoke softer. Even the overseer seemed nervous, glancing toward the big house as if it might swallow him whole. Then, one morning, a bell rang that hadn't been heard in months. The mistress was hosting her Christmas feast, the grandest of her gatherings. Carriages rolled up the drive again, wheels crunching over frozen dirt. The town gentry came dressed in velvet and pearls, pretending not to notice the hollow eyes watching them from the fields. We were ordered to clean, polish, and serve. The scent of roasting meat and wine filled the air, mixing with the stench of fear. The mistress wanted everything perfect. She said the year had been cleansed. Her words slithered through the kitchen like smoke. I carried trays from dawn till dusk, each step echoing on the marble floors. Through the open door I saw the guests laughing, their glasses catching candlelight. The mistress sat at the head of the table, her sons on either side, her smile thin as thread. Behind that smile was something wild, something breaking. Henry's hand shook when he raised his cup. Thomas wouldn't meet his mother's eyes. The overseer stood behind them, stiff as stone, pistol at his hip. Every sound felt too loud. The scrape of forks, the drip of wax, the heartbeat in my ears. When the clock struck 9, she stood. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate survival." Her toast hung in the air like a curse. And that was when I moved. All season I'd planned it, how to strike, how to end it. The poison was simple: crushed berries and a dust of bitter roots, mixed into the decanter of wine I poured myself, not enough to kill a man quickly, but enough to twist his insides into fire. My hands did not tremble as I poured. I watched the deep red swirl into each glass, catching the light like blood. When she raised her cup, the guests followed. When she drank, the room seemed to sigh. Minutes passed. A cough, then another, then the sound of glass shattering. Thomas gripped his throat, eyes bulging. Henry fell forward onto the table, knocking over a candle. Wax spilled, flames licked the cloth. The mistress stared at them both, horror blooming across her face. "What have you done?" she gasped. I stood at the doorway, the tray trembling against my palms. Behind me, others had gathered, men and women from the quarters, drawn by the noise, the smell of fire, the promise of an ending. Their eyes met mine. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The candle caught the wine, and the table burst into flame. Guests screamed. The curtains ignited, turning silk into ribbons of fire. The mistress tried to reach her sons, but the heat drove her back. Cain pulled his pistol, firing wildly, but smoke swallowed the room before he could aim. I turned and ran toward the back door. Outside, the night was alive with orange light and the roar of freedom. Chains clattered, voices rose. The fields burned brighter than the moon. Somewhere inside the inferno, the mistress's voice rose one last time, a scream, a prayer, or both. Then came silence. Rosehill was burning, and for the first time, I was not afraid of the fire. The sky that night was the color of vengeance. Flames climbed higher than the cypress trees, turning the heavens red and gold. Sparks rained down like stars falling to earth. The plantation, her empire, was dying, board by board, scream by scream. I stood on the edge of the yard, breathless, the heat crawling over my skin like an animal set free. For years, those walls had heard the cries of the chain, the whip's crack, the prayers that never reached heaven. Now, they were singing a new song, a hymn of ruin. Smoke billowed through the night, carrying with it the ghosts of every man, woman, and child who'd ever bled in those fields. I swear I could hear them, voices whispering through the flames, not in sorrow, but in thanks. Behind me, the others gathered. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stared, unable to believe what they saw. The overseer Cain stumbled from the inferno, his clothes burning, his voice breaking into animal sounds. He fell to his knees in the mud, reaching toward the house like a man begging his sins to come back. I didn't move. I just watched as the mistress's world turned to ash. A window shattered above us, glass exploding outward, showering us in tiny embers. Through the smoke, I saw her. The mistress. She stood at the top of the staircase, wrapped in flames. Her dress was burning, her hair glowing like a crown of fire. She looked straight at me, through the distance, through the smoke, and smiled. Not in fear, not in pain, but in something I can only call understanding. Then the ceiling gave way, and she was gone. The house collapsed in on itself with a roar that shook the ground. The heat was so fierce it drove us back toward the fields. We stood there, backs to the fire, faces streaked with sweat and ash. No one spoke. What could we say? The devil of Rosehill was gone, but her curse still lingered. At dawn, the flames had devoured everything but the stone steps and the iron gates. The air was thick with the smell of burned sugar, flesh, and freedom. I walked to the ruins alone. The ground was still hot beneath my feet. Beneath the blackened wood and twisted metal, I found what was left of her necklace, a string of pearls melted together into a single, shapeless lump. I buried it beneath a magnolia tree at the edge of the property. The soil was dark and soft, as if eager to swallow the last trace of her cruelty. Then I stood and watched the smoke drift upward into the pale Georgia sky. For the first time in my life, I felt the wind touch my face without permission. But freedom is a strange thing. It burns as fiercely as any fire. The others began to scatter. Some fled north that very night. Some stayed to rebuild, though there was nothing left to build on but bones and memory. I didn't know where I would go. only that I would never again answer to another person's name. As I walked away from Rose Hill, I looked back one last time. The sun had just risen, casting light over the ashes. It glowed like snow, soft and quiet, hiding the horror beneath. They would call it an accident. They always do. They'd say the mistress and her sons died in a tragic fire on Christmas Eve, 1847. But I knew the truth. Georgia's secret wasn't just that she ruled with cruelty. It was that the very blood she used to build her empire had turned against her. And I was the hand that lit the match. Morning came slow, pale, and silent. The smoke still lingered, twisting above the ruins of Rose Hill like a ghost that didn't yet know it was dead. The air was heavy with the scent of burned wood, wine, and something darker, something human. I remember standing in the middle of the field where the overseer once rode his horse and cracked his whip. Now, only his shadow remained, burned into the dirt like a scar the earth refused to forget. The others gathered around me, their faces blackened with soot and tears. Some held hands, some prayed. Some couldn't look at the house at all. The flames had given us freedom, but it was a freedom carved from pain. In the daylight, the cost of what we'd done was clearer. Bodies twisted in the ashes. Bones gleamed white beneath the char. The mistress, her sons, the guests, all of them lay somewhere beneath that mountain of ruin. The church bell in the distance rang for their souls, but no one among us said, "Amen." For the first time in my life, I realized how quiet the world could be without commands, without lashes, without screams. It was almost too quiet. We buried what we could. Not out of mercy, but out of necessity. The stench of death could choke even the strongest heart. Each shovel of dirt felt like sealing away a chapter of evil, locking it beneath the soil so it could never rise again. When night fell again, we built a small fire, not of rage this time, but of remembrance. We sat around it, telling stories of those who'd been lost long before the fire. Names whispered like hymns. Sarah, who'd been whipped for smiling. Jacob, who'd been hanged for stealing bread. Little Ruth, who'd been buried without a name at all. Their memories filled the air like a gentle rain, washing the ashes from our hearts. I took a single coal from that fire and carried it to the magnolia tree where I'd buried the mistress's melted pearls. The tree stood still, its bark blackened but alive. I pressed the coal into the dirt and whispered, "This ends with you." Then I walked north, toward the horizon, where they said freedom waited. But freedom is never where you expect it to be. It's not a place, not a piece of paper, it's a heartbeat that refuses to die. Weeks turned to months. I found work in a small town under a different name. At night, I'd wake to the sound of chains, only to realize they were gone. My wrists were bare. My back, though scarred, no longer bent. Years later, I heard rumors. They said a traveler found a tree near the ruins of an old plantation in Georgia, a tree that bloomed white even in winter. They said the ground around it glowed faintly at night, as if lit from beneath by the embers of something that could not be buried. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was holy. I know the truth. It was both. Every Christmas Eve, I dream of that night again. The fire, the screams, the sound of chains breaking like thunder. But in the dream, I am not afraid. I walk through the burning house, and the mistress's portrait on the wall turns to ash as I pass. Her eyes, once gray and cruel, turn soft, almost human. And then I wake to silence. If you listen close enough, on a winter night in Georgia, you can still hear the echo of chains melting into freedom, the wind carrying the voices of those who would never bow again. Because the truth of Rose Hill Plantation didn't die in the fire. It lives in the soil, in the smoke, in every breath of those who survived. They buried the mistress in her own ashes, and they buried her secret with her. But the earth remembers. It always does. And when the wind moves through the magnolias of Georgia, if you listen closely, you'll still hear her house burning.